Okay, so thanks everybody for coming. For those of you, most of you know me, but for those of you that don't, I'll give you the very brief version of my bio. So I'm a senior attorney with Gardner Law, specializing in FDA regulatory fraud and abuse, and legal and compliance considerations for pre and post-market med tech and pharmaceutical products. For those of you that know me, you also know that I could spend the entire 3.5 hours talking, so I could regale you with stories. And so somebody wave your hand if I blow past 2 o'clock. So I'm going to jump in. We're going to talk about healthcare enforcement and kind of emerging from the pandemic and the kind of the unique circumstances that provides to us. So first of all, we'll do a brief kind of highlight of some enforcement action that is happening, and then we're going to talk about some of those pandemic considerations, what that provided to the med tech and pharmaceutical industry, and then we'll discuss how all this kind of plays into due diligence activities. So I'm going to start with a poll. We good? Okay. I'm going to start with a poll. So for those of you online, if you could go ahead and indicate any of these that apply, what disciplines or parts of the organization do you have responsibilities for in your organization? And while people online are selecting that, I'm going to just fire these off really quick, and if you could raise your hand. So first of all, legal. Okay, so a good chunk of the people here. Regulatory. Okay, likewise. Quality. Okay, couple. Clinical. Looks like 1. And finance. 1. All right, great. So, one of the things that I kind of want to dig into in this, and do we have?
Yes. So the online results are 66% legal, 48% regulatory, 24% quality, 7% clinical, and another 7% for finance.
Okay, got it. Excellent. So when we think about due diligence, and I'm mostly thinking about acquisition targets as I'm having this discussion. Although having a chat with one of you before this, it reminded me that even if you're entering into a partnership with an organization, you may be co-marketing, co-branding, you may be putting a product out alongside another organization. What we're going to talk about today are some of the considerations that go into that. I think we traditionally think of due diligence and the consulting firms that we hire for due diligence activities. We think of kind of financial fitness. We think of competitive assessments and market assessments, targets, everybody's favorite word, synergies. I don't even know what that word means, to be perfectly honest, but it's a favorite of consultants. Operations, and then, legal, obviously, litigation, liability matters, IP. And then when it comes to regulatory, we think about approvals or clearances. We think about active or approved clinical trials. But so often, when I'm discussing acquisition target due diligence considerations with life science clients, there's this bucket of amorphous or kind of yet to be realized risk. And so that's where I start to think about some of the considerations, which are in the blue here, that are a little bit different from what your standard or your consultant organization due diligence activities might consider. As I was putting this together, I'm not a huge Liam Neeson fan, and I neither have a deep enough voice nor a Northern Irish accent that I can present this to you in. But when he says he has a particular set of skills in the movie Taken, I think about some of the regulatory and compliance due diligence considerations that it really takes kind of a broad approach or a broad breadth of knowledge in this area to understand how you might need to guide your business, how you might need to guide your finance leadership as to going into particularly an acquisition. So, like I said, under standard due diligence, you've got things like financial fitness, you've got competitive assessments, litigation, employment. But then when it gets to some of the regulatory and compliance due diligence considerations, it's important to think about some of the things that the documentation that a standard company would have in place that it may not reflect already. So Things like inspections and audits that may not have happened or may not have happened recently. Clinical activity in quotes, which I will explain what I mean by that in a minute. Reimbursement practices, sales training as kind of a proxy for what the sales team is actually engaged in. And then claims, which I won't go over too much because I don't want to step on Nate's presentation in a little bit. So, when I look at FDA enforcement and when I think about acquisitions, none of these are specifically in the context of an acquisition. None of these are saying FDA issued a warning letter, an untitled letter to somebody that had just recently been acquired or was in the process of being acquired. But when I think about enforcement updates and how it ties to today's topic of today's program, it's important to know what's going on so you can know what to look out for. So I'm going to hit on a couple of these, and then I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive on the next slide. So first of all, Procter & Gamble received a warning letter, I think 2 months ago. It was for NyQuil, which is something that, a product that I'm sure most of us have used. The particular issue was an incongruency between labeled active ingredients and the electronic listing file. And so, I highlight this one as a kind of a takeaway from this is confirm processes and procedures, and at minimum spot check regulatory filings against product documentation. So this is something that I think if you took at face value the labeling and you took at face value the electronic listing, you would assume that everything was on the up and up. Procter & Gamble's now dealing with a warning letter. They're having to remediate that. The next one, this is kind of a higher profile one that many of you might be aware of, but Makena, a drug approved under the accelerated approval pathway some years ago to reduce the risk of preterm birth in high-risk pregnancies. It ended up having what FDA considered to be an unacceptably unfavorable benefit risk assessment. And so the product was withdrawn. They're evaluating the extent to which it may still have an indication that could save it and that it could re-enter the market. But I think here the takeaway is that you should familiar yourself with post-market evidence. The product was put on the market based on the pre-market evidence. Post-market evidence ended up putting it at risk. I would also highlight that these types of actions don't come as a surprise, typically. You don't typically get a letter saying you're required to withdraw from the market without having had some discussions with FDA. That was 2.5 years ago that these discussions were first publicly, that we were made aware of them. So make sure you do a quick Google search of the companies you're acquiring. Cornea Association of Texas. So I think a lot of you probably are not here representing a clinic for eye doctors, but there is something relevant from this warning letter that I'd like to highlight. And when I talked about, Medavance I'm skipping over because we're going to talk about that on the next slide. When I talked about clinical activities with air quotes, so this warning letter arose from a BIMO program inspection. There was a 69 subject in clinical trial all of them were enrolled and the clinical trial was underway. And this organization had failed to secure an IND exemption for an investigational new drug. And when I say clinical activity, this is obviously a pretty egregious example of where they're actually investigating a new drug. They've not gone through the regulations to ensure that they have an exemption in order to do that legally. And so it resulted in a warning letter. But I can't tell you how many times I hear about these little clinical, you've got the clinical team out there kind of just playing around, trying to kind of investigate, research a little bit. And oftentimes I hear about things like that, and they sound quite a bit to me like there's something that would require an IDE or an IND to perform. And so understanding this would never come up if you were evaluating their clinical trial or their approved clinical trial portfolio, because they don't have one. So you want to make sure that you're aware of some of the clinical, quote, activities that individuals or the companies are engaged in. In the quality and CAPA control space, I'll just highlight quickly, FDA has been a little more active with regards to having adequate, in fact, the highest percentage of enforcement actions have been in the space related either to not having adequate procedures, written procedures and policies, or not following them. I think something like 23% of untitled and warning letters in the last 2 years have been for that particular offense. And so all of these arose from that. You've got a GMP requirements for an OTC product and failure to comply with CAP and investigation procedures for Zermatt. Champaklal, I don't pretend to be or even have ever traveled to India, but it's a company from India. It's an OTC drug manufacturer, and they ended up with toxic materials in the imported product. I'll speak a little bit more about this in a second, but I'll just highlight that material assessments for products, particularly pharmaceuticals from outside the US, has been a particular focus from FDA recently. And then Sonovo, which I will talk about on the next slide briefly. So, brief deep dive on a few actions. And so Medavance is a company that holds a 510K for a dental device, the Velopex AquaCut Fluid Abrasion Unit. Easy for you to say. And it was discovered that since their clearance in 2003, they had made significant changes to the product. Those changes had not been addressed, had not been presented to the agency. Neither a new 510K or a special 510K had been submitted, and FDA determined that a new 510K was required for two reasons. One, the changes were of the type that was significant as to safety of the product. The changes arose from reliability concerns in the product. And two, that the changes were significant, so significant that the essential technology of the product was different. And so I highlight this warning letter to remind you that you need to not only rely on the fact or review the fact that you've got a 510K and that the product may resemble the 510K that was cleared, but you also need to look at what changes have been made to the product. And remember that when you're evaluating changes to a 510K product, you're not individually evaluating the last change that was made, but you're comprehensively evaluating all the changes that have made since the 510K was originally issued. Sonovo, somewhat similar, although it bridges the gap a little bit into the next topic. So Sonovo has a 510K for a hip system, a femoral resurfacing cap and total hip system. Critical to that 510K was that it was cleared for cemented use only. The company made significant changes, both labeling changes as well as some technology changes, to account for and allow for non-cemented use. FDA determined that not only did that make a significant change to the product, including its intended use, but it actually made it something that may have been subject to a PMA as opposed to a 510K. In addition to that, FDA then found that they had been engaged in unlawful promotion as a result of marketing it for non-cemented use. I will highlight that when FDA sends you a warning letter, they rarely just comment on the one thing. So both of these companies got slammed with a litany of other things, because if they're going to send one, they're going to get their money's worth. So there's a whole bunch of remediation that ends up on your hands when you have one of these issues. And so I think it probably goes without saying it's best to not get a warning letter. And if you do, there's a significant amount of work that goes into that. So, there's kind of two takeaways from these. I think one is the changes in design and assessing the product as it's marketed today versus what it was originally cleared for, particularly focusing on reliability issues, I would say. I think the Medavance situation highlights that. The other thing is that these types of issues can create considerable product liability concerns as well. It became very public knowledge that there were reliability issues with the Medavance product, and it became very public knowledge that Sonovo had been marketing the product for what is, and I'm no expert in hip replacements, but what is a significant difference in what they had originally presented safety and efficacy data for. And I anticipate that plaintiff's bar is very interested in that. Lastly, we'll highlight very briefly the Biogen case. This, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. It was 10 years in the making, a settlement that I believe was a $900 million settlement. And and it arose from speakers programs that were essentially sham speakers programs. That OIG and DOJ highlighted a couple of things that were occurring. One was they were topics that were being presented in speakers programs basically were of no value to the company. Physicians that were prescribing Biogen MS drugs were being encouraged to speak on topics that the company didn't stand to benefit from in any way. Second, the sales force was really running the speaker program, which if your policy on speaker programs doesn't already prohibit that, I would encourage you to go update it when you leave here today. Basically, the sales force was allowed to use the offer of an individual, of a prescriber, participating in the speaker program as an incentive because they were being flown to fantastic places. They were all entertainment-style venues with very expensive alcohols, skiing, and other sorts of activities around exactly what you'd expect when you're going to go hear about an MS drug. So this was a significant settlement. A significant amount of money was paid. And I highlight it in part because speaker programs are one of the things that we work with clients the most on, that they come to us and they say, hey, we want to have physicians that are speaking on our behalf, but we don't have a policy on point. And this just highlights to me that you really should have a policy on point. And what you should be evaluating for a potential acquisition is whether or not they're engaged in these things in a compliant way. And I think that brings up the topic very briefly of successor liability, which I won't pretend to be an M&A expert. If you're acquiring a company, we're happy to support you in these activities. We also encourage you and are happy to refer you to an attorney that supports specifically M&A activities. But what I would say is this: depending on the transaction structure, you may end up with liability that you're acquiring along with the company. In certain structures, you may not, and that is really up to the M&A and to the structure of the transaction. But what I would say is, even if you don't inherit that liability from a financial or legal perspective, some of the pains in the butt that go along with these things, you almost certainly will inherit. So, for example, to the extent that there is a sales force that is coming over, there are policies that are continuing over, and you end up with a corporate integrity agreement, or you end up with significant remediation activities. Just know that even if you've structured your transaction to avoid successor liability, you may still have a whole lot of unenjoyable activities that come along with the acquisition. Really briefly, I'm going to highlight FTC enforcement. And so as I think most of you know, there's a memorandum of understanding between FTC and FDA as to regulating promotion and advertising of medical products. Generally, primary responsibility for non-restricted medical devices goes to FTC, whereas prescription drugs and restricted devices lies with FDA. FTC, however, has recently reminded industry, and they're not shy about reminding everybody, that just because primary responsibility may be with one agency versus the other, that they have not ceded jurisdiction as to those claims. So you need to be aware of FTC as well and their regulations under the FTC Act. I think the primary issue that arose last month is that the topic of substantiation of claims. To ensure that your claims are substantiated, FTC uses a reasonable basis test, which I would speak to if I hadn't just gotten the 5-minute sign that I'm almost up. So I'm going to scoot past that, but I'm happy to speak with any of you later today about that. And I'm sure Nate will touch on it as well. So really quick, as we exit the pandemic, there are a few things that are unique in today's due diligence world that you need to be considering. So one is a whole slew of EUAs, emergency use authorizations, were granted during the pandemic. There is a transition plan for those, but there's a lot of work that goes into that. There's a lot of timing that you need to stay on top of, and you may not be able to market your product if you don't comply with the transition plan. The same goes for certain new products that hit the market during the pandemic. There were a variety of enforcement discretion policies that FDA put out as to somewhat lower risk, but still class 2 products that could be put on the market without pre-market notification. Evaluating the company's ability to meet the transition plan timelines in order to maintain the product on the market is critical. If it doesn't happen, you may be starting over from scratch. On inspections and audits, I'll just say FDA went from it was something like 45% of specific to foreign pharmaceutical manufacturers, because it's kind of a stark contrast, so it's a good number to use. 45% of firms had been inspected in 2019. In 2022, it was 6%. So there are a lot of, I'll just say, hidden landmines out there that not necessarily that FDA would have caught them all. And there are plenty of firms out there that are staying on top of things. But just know that there are landmines that you need to look out for. To the extent that that manufacturers have been performing audits themselves, mock audits, that certainly goes in the direction of better diligence on their part. And I'll just say FDA has started to kind of give a highlight as to how its enforcement is going to evolve in the coming years and coming out of the pandemic. They certainly will be using remote inspections more. I don't know if any of you have been involved in a remote inspection with a laptop that you can carry around and FDA can inspect on site. Yeah, that's great. So, and FDA has said they're going to keep doing that because it's saving them money, and Congress doesn't like giving them money. So, that's something that I think will continue to be refined in the coming years. So, briefly, as kind of a key takeaways, a big part of this is just know where the company's at today, know where it's going, and know where you want it to go. That's particularly, I'm referencing claims when I think of that, and I'll really defer to Nate's discussion on that. But I'll just say, make sure that you've engaged your marketing, make sure you've engaged your product, make sure you've engaged those individuals that think they know what they're going to be able to say about or how they're going to be able to sell your product. Engage them early on so that you can evaluate whether or not there's a legitimate basis for doing that. Make sure that you've invested in quality oversight prior to in the process of these activities. Like I said, EUAs, products subject to regulatory enforcement discretion, special lens on those and the activities that are necessary to continue to market them after the PHE, and even potentially seeking outside independent regulatory opinion for some of these things, which is fairly common. As to compliance, the two things that I would really highlight are looking into sales training as evidence of sales practices, certainly to the extent you have a window into in fact sales practices. That's really important too, but just remember that sales training is something that FDA as well as OIG look at as kind of evidence of what the firm intends its sales force to do. And then make sure that you understand that inherited liability is not just on the transaction itself, but the remediation work and the other expensive stuff that can come with inheriting a mess. So that's it. I think we have time for a couple of questions if anybody has any. No? Perfect. All right, I will hand it off to Mark.